Have you ever wondered why generations of British wrestling fans all seem to share the same memories? The town halls, the theatres, the holiday camps, the glossy programmes, the larger-than-life villains, the family atmosphere, the foam hands. If you grew up watching British wrestling after the television boom of the 1970s and 80s, there was a handful of promoters responsible for keeping that experience alive. But the one that stands out the most was Brian Dixon. When Brian passed away in 2023, people didn't just mourn a wrestling promoter. Many felt we were saying goodbye to an entire era of British wrestling, and I completely understand why, because Brian wasn't simply someone whose shows I attended. He was the man who gave me my very first opportunity in professional wrestling. Hello everyone, I'm Josh Faulkner, the wrestling comedian. Make sure you drop a like and give me a follow. This is part one of the incredible story of Brian Dixon. Every wrestling promoter starts somewhere. Most don't begin with money or television deals or famous wrestlers. They start exactly where all of us do, as fans. Brian George Dixon was born in 1947 in Liverpool. Growing up, Britain was entering what many people now call the golden age of professional wrestling. Television audiences were exploding. Venues across the country were packed every week. The stars of wrestling were becoming household names. And for a young Brian Dixon, there was one place that captured his imagination more than anywhere else: Liverpool Stadium. Today, it's remembered as one of the true cathedrals of British wrestling. Week after week, some of the greatest names in Europe appeared there. Heavyweights, middleweights, lightweights, women wrestlers, international visitors. It wasn't simply somewhere Brian watched wrestling. It became the place where he fell in love with the entire business. Not just what happened inside the ring, but everything around it. The posters, the crowds, the anticipation, the atmosphere. Long before he ever promoted a wrestling show, Brian was already studying them. Most fans watch wrestling. Brian wanted to be involved in it. In the late 1960s, he became heavily involved in the A to Z Wrestling Fan Club, one of Britain's best-known wrestling supporter organisations. Remember, this was decades before Facebook, before YouTube, before wrestling websites. If you wanted to connect with other fans, you joined a fan club. Brian helped organise newsletters, collected photographs, corresponded with wrestlers, built friendships across the country. He later became closely associated with the Jim Breaks fan club, developing relationships with many of the biggest stars of the time in British wrestling. It might not sound particularly glamorous, but those fan clubs became Brian's wrestling education. He discovered what fans wanted, who drew crowds, which wrestlers people talked about, how promotions communicated with supporters. Without realising it, Brian was already learning to become a promoter. Eventually, Brian's enthusiasm earned him opportunities behind the scenes. He became involved with the wrestling at Liverpool Stadium itself, working as a referee, as a second, helping wherever it was needed. And that's where Brian received the greatest education any promoter could have. Because running a wrestling show isn't just about putting two names on a poster. Someone has to hire the building, book the wrestlers, arrange transport, sell tickets, organise advertising, print programs, handle emergencies when wrestlers don't arrive, pay everyone at the end of the night. Brian watched all of it. He absorbed everything. The experienced promoters probably had no idea, but standing quietly on the edge of those shows was the man who would eventually outlast almost every single one of them. Then, Brian met someone who completely changed the direction of his life: Mitzi Muller. Mitzi wasn't just another wrestler. She was one of Britain's very best female competitors. Women's wrestling in Britain has always occupied a strange position. Audiences loved it, but opportunities weren't always consistent. Promoters often treated it as an attraction rather than an essential part of every show. Brian believed differently. According to one of the stories often told over the years, whilst refereeing one of Mitzi's matches, Brian accidentally stood on her long hair during the contest. It certainly wasn't the smoothest introduction, but eventually the two became a couple, then husband and wife, and together they would build one of the most important wrestling companies Britain has ever seen. Brian later said that seeing the difficulties Mitzi faced in securing enough bookings convinced him that instead of waiting for opportunities, he should create them himself. That decision would change British wrestling forever. In October 1970, Brian branched out from the Liverpool Stadium and launched his own company, Wrestling Enterprises of Birkenhead. At first, it was incredibly small. There was no television, no national reputation, no guaranteed audiences, just determination. Brian himself booked the halls, promoted the shows, handled the administration, worked with the wrestlers. He wasn't sitting in an office giving orders, he was doing absolutely everything, and perhaps that explains why decades later he never lost touch with the realities of promoting. Brian understood every single job because he'd done every single job except wrestle. There were obstacles, of course. It wasn't just plain sailing. In fact, when Brian ran his first show, the evening's takings were stolen out of the boot of his car as he enjoyed a post-show meal. Brian wasn't trying to copy Joint Promotions. He couldn't. Joint Promotions had the biggest stars. They had the television contracts, the established venues. Instead, Brian built something different. He focused on exciting cards, strong family entertainment, international visitors, women's wrestling, young wrestlers looking for opportunities. He looked for places where other promoters weren't looking. He thought differently, worked harder, traveled further, and slowly the audiences started growing. Then something happened that nobody could have predicted. A young promoter from Liverpool who had started out running wrestling fan clubs was about to challenge the most powerful organization British wrestling had ever known. Joint Promotions, and incredibly, he was going to win. When Brian Dixon started promoting wrestling in 1970, the odds were firmly stacked against him. British wrestling wasn't an open market. It wasn't like today, where anyone could hire a ring, print some posters, and run a show. The business was dominated by one organization: Joint Promotions. For decades, Joint Promotions controlled the biggest venues, the biggest stars, and perhaps most importantly, the television cameras. If you wanted to become Britain's biggest wrestling promoter, you had to compete with a machine that had been established for decades. Most people wouldn't have even tried. Brian Dixon did. Throughout the 1970s, Brian slowly expanded wrestling enterprises. There were no shortcuts, no overnight successes. Every new town had to be won over. Every venue had to be secured. Every audience had to be earned. Brian understood something many promoters overlooked. If a family enjoyed your show, they'd come back. So every event had to deliver. Heroes children could believe in, villains everybody loved to hate, comedy, technical wrestling, heavyweights, lightweights, women's wrestling, a little bit of everything. Long before people started talking about sports entertainment, Brian had already realized that a successful wrestling show wasn't just about the matches. It was about sending families home smiling. That philosophy became the blueprint for all-star wrestling. And whether people admit it or not, it's a blueprint that countless British wrestling promoters have copied ever since. One of the things that always impressed me about Brian was the respect he had from other promoters. Professional wrestling can be an incredibly competitive business. Promoters fight over venues, fight over dates, some even fight over wrestlers, but every now and then, two people come along who simply understand each other. For Brian Dixon, one of those people was Orig Williams. Better known to wrestling fans as El Bandito, Orig wasn't just one of Wales's most recognizable wrestlers, he was also one of its greatest promoters. Like Brian, he believed wrestling belonged to ordinary people, not just big cities. He took wrestling into towns across Wales and across Ireland and built a fiercely loyal following through his own promotions and later through S4C's Reslo. Brian was doing exactly the same thing in England. While other people saw competition, Brian and Orig saw opportunity. They shared wrestlers, helped one another, supported each other's promotions, and over the years built a genuine friendship that lasted for decades. It's easy to think of Brian as simply the man behind All-Star Wrestling, but his influence reached much further than that. He became part of a network of independent promoters who refused to let British wrestling disappear. Between them, Brian in England, Orig in Wales, and their friends and colleagues across Ireland, they kept professional wrestling alive in places where many believed it had no future. When Orig sadly passed away in 2009, British wrestling lost one of its true showmen. One thing became obvious very quickly. Brian had an exceptional eye for people. He could spot potential before almost anyone else. Sometimes it was an experienced wrestler who'd never quite reached the top. Sometimes it was somebody completely unknown. He wasn't interested in what someone already was. He wanted to know what they could become. And that mindset helped All-Star become home to some of Britain's finest performers. It also earned Brian enormous respect in dressing rooms across the country, because if Brian believed in you, he'd give you an opportunity. Not because you were famous, not because you knew the right people, because he thought you deserved it. And that attitude would become one of the defining characteristics of his entire career. By the early 1980s, something remarkable was happening. Brian Dixon's promotion wasn't simply surviving, it was growing, the crowds were growing, the venues were getting bigger, the quality of the wrestling was improving. Some of Britain's biggest names were choosing to work for Brian instead of relying solely on joint promotions. Kendo Nagasaki, Rollerball Rocco, Johnny Saint, Tony Sinclair, Mighty John Quinn, and so many more. Brian wasn't trying to destroy British wrestling. He was giving wrestlers another place to earn a living. Competition made everybody stronger. One of Brian's closest allies in the early years of wrestling enterprises was John Harris. Harris, the renowned joint promotions MC, left joint promotions, and through his contacts with venue managers after years of touring halls across the country, he was able to get the word out for Brian that the TV stars who had also left joint promotions were wrestling for a new outfit, and the halls were quick to snap up the new presentation who offered something different to the Big Daddy Roadshow. Then came one of the greatest achievements of Brian's entire career, one that still doesn't receive the recognition it deserves. In 1986, the year after ITV cancelled World of Sport, it made an extraordinary decision. Instead of relying solely on joint promotions for its standalone coverage of wrestling, it would also begin showing all-star wrestling. Think about that for a moment. Brian had started as a wrestling fan, running newsletters, helping fan clubs, taking photographs, refereeing, learning the business from the ground up. Now, his wrestling promotion was appearing on national television alongside the biggest wrestling company Britain had ever known. It wasn't handed to him. He earned it. For years, Brian had built a company that ITV simply couldn't ignore anymore. Suddenly, millions of viewers were seeing all-star wrestling every Saturday afternoon. Different wrestlers, different presentation, different ideas. British wrestling had genuine competition again. For decades, many believed joint promotions could never be challenged. Brian Dixon proved them wrong. A little known story actually about Brian getting the ITV contract is just before the deal was signed, the bank were going to pull the plug on Brian's overdraft. Luckily, Brian managed to convince the bank manager to hold off for a few days until the signature was on the contract, and the rest is history. Around the same period, British audiences were beginning to discover something very different: the World Wrestling Federation. Colourful, larger than life, American, exploding in popularity, ITV found itself in a unique position. On one hand, traditional British wrestling, on the other, the global phenomenon that was the WWF. And remarkably, Brian Dixon's All-Star Wrestling found itself sharing television with both. From 1986 until ITV's coverage of wrestling ended in 1988, Brian's promotion stood shoulder to shoulder with the biggest names in British wrestling and the biggest wrestling company in the world. For someone who'd started with little more than determination, it was an incredible achievement. Just as Brian reached the biggest stage of his career, everything changed. In 1988, ITV pulled the plug on professional wrestling. After more than 3 decades, weekly British televised wrestling was gone. For many promotions, that would have been the end. Without television, crowds dropped. Some of British wrestling's biggest names walked away from the business altogether. It would have been easy for Brian to do the same. He didn't. Instead, he asked a different question. If television had gone, where were the fans? And Brian already knew the answer. They were still in Britain's towns, still in its theatres, still in its holiday camps. They just needed someone willing to visit them. Brian didn't spend the next few years mourning what British wrestling had lost. He built something new. He expanded his touring schedule. He strengthened relationships with theatres and civic halls. And then he secured a partnership that would define the next decades of his career: Butlins holiday camps. That single agreement would introduce live professional wrestling to hundreds of thousands of families. It would produce future stars, create lifelong fans, and without any exaggeration, help keep British wrestling alive. For many people watching this video, including me, this is where our Brian Dixon story really begins. When people talk about Brian Dixon's greatest achievement, some will say challenging joint promotions. Others will say getting All-Star Wrestling onto ITV. Some will point to the incredible longevity of his promotion. But I think his greatest achievement came after all of those things, because after television disappeared, Brian somehow managed to make British wrestling part of family holidays. For decades, if your family went to Butlins, there's a good chance you saw All-Star Wrestling. Night after night, holiday camp after holiday camp, Brian Dixon brought live professional wrestling to families who may never have stepped inside a town hall or a leisure centre to watch it otherwise. For many children, it wasn't just their first wrestling show, it was their first live sporting event, their first heroes, their first villains, their first time shouting at a wrestler, the first autograph, the first program, and for many, it became the highlight of their holiday. Brian understood something that many promoters never truly appreciated. Children didn't care whether wrestling was fashionable, they cared whether it was exciting. If they left smiling, they'd remember it forever. That's exactly what happened. Thousands upon thousands of families grew up with Brian Dixon's wrestling. Some became lifelong fans, some became wrestlers, some became promoters, some became referees, others simply carried those memories into adulthood. The influence of those Butlin shows is impossible to measure because it isn't measured in ticket sales, it's measured in memories. I was one of those children. Some of my happiest childhood memories involved Brian Dixon's shows. Every year we'd go on family holidays to Butlins in Bognor Regis and I'd count down the days until wrestling night. Even my nan remembers Brian, not as the legendary promoter, not as the man who challenged joint promotions, not as the man who kept British wrestling alive when ITV pulled the plug. She remembers him as the old boy selling the foam hands in the programs. I've always loved that because it perfectly sums Brian up. Here was arguably the biggest promoter in British wrestling, and he'd still be standing there himself, selling programs, selling foam hands. There was no ego, no sense that certain jobs were beneath him. Brian understood something very simple. Every single person through those doors mattered. But it wasn't just Butlins where I got my wrestling fix. My granddad used to take me to Brian's town shows as well. High Wycombe Town Hall, the Beck Theatre in Hayes, sitting there as a kid, watching wrestlers I'd only ever dreamed of seeing in person. The atmosphere, the music, the anticipation before the first bell, I absolutely loved it. If there was one thing every wrestler who worked for Brian says, it's this: nobody worked harder. People often see the promoter standing at the entrance on show day or announcing something before the show. What they don't see is everything that comes before that. Brian would spend all day around the wrestling show, travelling to it, ensuring it ran smoothly, then driving hundreds of miles home, sometimes arriving in the early hours of the morning, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 a.m. Most people would take the next day off. Not Brian. At 9 o'clock sharp, like clockwork, he'd be at his office, 81 Fountain Street, and that address became legendary in British wrestling. For decades, it was the nerve centre of all-star wrestling. Every booking, every phone call, every poster, every programme, every contract, every invoice, every problem, it all seemed to pass through Brian's desk. If you phoned the office, there was a very good chance you spoke to Brian himself. The work never stopped. Brian simply got on with it, week after week, month after month, year after year, for more than 50 years. I honestly don't know how he did it, especially when coordinating multiple shows a day. In his later years, when supplying both Butlins and Haven with wrestling, there could be up to 10 plus shows a day in peak summer seasons, but it still all came together. The wrestlers got to the shows, and so did a fresh batch of foam hands. If you worked for Brian, sooner or later you found yourself at 81 Fountain Street. There was something almost magical about that office. That was really no more than Brian's childhood bedroom in the family home in Birkenhead. There was posters everywhere, photographs, boxes of programs, schedules, paperwork, telephones constantly ringing. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't some corporate headquarters, it was simply the beating heart of British wrestling. Everything flowed through there. 81 Fountain Street also served as the digs, where travelling wrestlers would call it home for their spells here. One thing people outside British wrestling sometimes overlook is just how many future stars passed through All-Star Wrestling. Brian had built something incredibly valuable, not just another wrestling promotion, but a place where wrestlers could learn their craft in front of real crowds. Night after night, town after town, holiday camp after holiday camp. If you wanted to improve, there was no substitute for wrestling every day. Word spread pretty quickly. Long before WWE and AEW signed many wrestlers, they came to work for Brian. Sheamus, Drew McIntyre, Wade Barrett, Bryan Danielson, Nigel McGuinness, Chris Hero, Colt Cabana, Sami Zayn, Andre Chase, Cash Wheeler, and countless others. They all benefited from the opportunities Brian created. That's one of his greatest legacies. He wasn't just producing wrestling shows, he was also producing wrestlers. Brian didn't just help create future stars, he also gave British fans the chance to meet legends they'd only ever seen on television, and also incredible international wrestlers that made their careers outside the bright lights of WWE. As the years went on, All-Star Wrestling became home to an incredible list of former WWE, WCW, and international names. Gangrel, Finlay, Brody Steele, Chad Collier, Joe Legend, the Honky Tonk Man, Earthquake, the Bushwhackers, PN News, Marty Jannetty, Tatanka, and so many others. Some came for special tours, some wrestled repeatedly, some shared dressing rooms with young British wrestlers who'd grown up watching them on television. That was another of Brian's strengths. He understood nostalgia. Families who remembered watching WWF in the 1980s and 90s suddenly had the chance to see those same stars live, often just a few miles from home. At the same time, those international names were sharing the ring with Britain's next generation. Brian had created something unique. His shows celebrated wrestling's past whilst quietly building its future. By the early 1990s, British wrestling had reached one of its lowest points in its history. World of Sport had gone, television exposure had disappeared, many of the old stars had retired, crowds were smaller, venues were closing their doors to wrestling one by one. Promotions disappeared. If ever there was a time to walk away, this was it. But Brian Dixon never really knew how to walk away. One of Brian's greatest strengths wasn't just promoting wrestling, it was promoting entertainment. He understood audiences, he understood marketing, and above all, he understood that if one door closed, you found another one. Throughout the 1990s, when wrestling, not just in Britain but across the Atlantic, dipped in popularity, Brian diversified. He promoted concerts, live shows, touring productions, and when The Full Monty became one of Britain's biggest films, Brian recognised another opportunity. He began promoting touring male revue shows across the country. To some people, it probably seems strange, the wrestling promoter suddenly promoting male strip shows, but Brian wasn't sentimental, he was practical. Those shows helped keep the business moving. They generated income, they kept venues open, they maintained relationships around the country. And while Brian was promoting all these other events, he never abandoned wrestling altogether. All Star continued. Maybe not every night of the week anymore, but it was still there. Croydon, Hanley, Bristol, the engine never completely stopped. That's something I think people often overlook. Brian didn't just survive the collapse of British wrestling, he found ways to make sure wrestling survived alongside him. One of Brian's greatest strengths was recognizing when wrestling needed to change. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the traditional World of Sport style of wrestling was beginning to evolve. Audiences were watching American wrestling, Japanese wrestling. The pace was changing. Brian recognized that. Rather than resisting it, he embraced it. He often credited a group of young wrestlers from Stoke-on-Trent with helping bring fresh energy to All-Star Wrestling. In that group, Dean Allmark, Robbie Dynamite, Mikey Whiplash, Kid Cool, they brought faster movement, more athleticism, a style influenced by American independence while still respecting British fundamentals. Brian didn't see them as replacing traditional British wrestling. He saw them as helping it evolve. And that willingness to look outside his bubble and adapt is one of the reasons All-Star Wrestling survived for so much longer than so many of its rivals. Brian understood that preserving wrestling didn't mean freezing it in time. Sometimes the only way to preserve something is to let it grow. As wrestling changed during the 1990s and early 2000s, inspired by the boom of WWE's Attitude Era, Brian wasn't afraid to experiment. One example of this was the tribute shows with characters inspired by WWE favourites, larger-than-life personalities, colourful costumes, and stipulation matches. Shows designed to capture the imagination of younger audiences who had grown up watching American wrestling on television. Some people criticised the idea. Brian didn't really care. All-Star Wrestling never became a fully-fledged tribute promotion. So whilst others were condemning the concept, families were buying tickets, children were leaving with smiles on their faces and a foam hand, and many of those children were watching live wrestling for the very first time. People often think of All-Star Wrestling as Brian Dixon, but behind the scenes, it was very much a family business. Mitzi Mueller had been there from the very beginning. Without her, there's a very good chance Wrestling Enterprises would never have existed in the first place. She wasn't simply Brian's wife. She was his partner in every sense of the word. Then, there was Letitia. To generations of fans, she was the familiar voice welcoming everyone to another evening of All-Star Wrestling action. If you went to enough All-Star shows, you instantly recognized her voice, but introducing the rest wrestlers was only a tiny part of what she did. Behind the scenes, she helped with the administration, organization, merchandise, the countless jobs that audiences never saw. Like Brian, she understood that wrestling doesn't run itself. Every successful show depends on dozens of jobs that nobody applauds, and the Dixon family did them all. Eventually, Brian started preparing the next generation, his grandson, Joseph. Like so many people in wrestling, Joseph didn't suddenly become a promoter overnight. He learned the ropes from one of the world's best wrestling promoters. Brian knew something every great promoter eventually has to accept. No one can do it forever. The business has to outlive you. In the final years of Brian's life, Joseph took on more and more responsibility. Brian wasn't just handing over a company, he was handing over a legacy. Whenever I get asked, what was Brian Dixon really like? The answer is exactly the same man you saw at the shows. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, he wasn't interested in making himself the star. Brian cared about the show. And if you didn't pull off Brian's vision of the shows, whether fairly or unfairly, you could be in for a bollocking. And I was, on more than one occasion. Whenever I'm asked how I got my start as a professional wrestler, the answer is simple. Brian Dixon. When I was 15 years old, he gave me an opportunity. He didn't have to. He could have easily looked at me at 15 and said, come back in a few years. Instead, he gave me that chance at one of his famous long-standing venues, the Fairfield Halls, Croydon. The 16th of January 2011 is a date I'll always remember, my very first All-Star Wrestling match, and a match that started a journey of working for Brian pretty consistently for over 12 years. I'd done just about every job for Brian and All-Star. I wrestled, I refereed, I MC'd, I bill posted, I sold merchandise, and learned so much in all those areas about the job I've been passionate about ever since I can remember. It's funny looking back now because as a child I was sitting in the audience at Brian's shows, pestering him on what wrestlers were on that night at the merch table, buying programs, watching my heroes, getting the backstage pass, dreaming and modestly manifesting at the day I'd be one of the wrestlers travelling those same roads. Brian gave countless people that opportunity. I'm just fortunate enough to be one of them. Then came May 2023. News started spreading around the wrestling world that Brian Dixon had passed away. Even though you know one day these moments will come, you're never really prepared. I attended Brian's funeral, and looking around, you realise just how many lives he'd touched. People travelled from not just across the UK, but from all over the world to pay their respects. Wrestlers, referees, seconds, promoters, ring announcers, family and friends. When Brian died, people asked what happens to All-Star Wrestling now. Thankfully, Joseph, Letitia, Tony Spitfire and Danny Collins were there, leaving it in more than capable hands. The company Brian had spent over 50 years building continues, and I'm sure that's exactly what Brian would have wanted, because Brian never believed British wrestling was about one individual. It was about keeping the tradition alive, keeping the next generation coming through, giving young wrestlers opportunities, giving families a great night out. Today, All-Star Wrestling continues to pack houses across the country, sending families home with smiles on their faces. And with two credible training schools in Salisbury and North Shields, the next crop of talent continues to come through. Sometimes people measure promoters by championships, attendance records, television ratings. Brian achieved plenty of those things and so much more, but I don't think that's his greatest legacy. His greatest legacy is that thousands of us have a Brian Dixon story. Maybe yours happened at Butlins, maybe it was at Croydon, maybe Hanley, maybe High Wycombe, maybe the Beck Theatre in Hayes, maybe somewhere else entirely. Maybe you met your favourite wrestler because of Brian. Maybe you became a wrestler because of Brian. Maybe, like me, you grew up believing that once the music hit and the curtains opened, magic was about to happen. That's what Brian gave us, memories. And unlike championship belts, those memories never fade. Brian Dixon challenged the establishment. He broke into national television. He kept British wrestling alive after television walked away. He opened doors for wrestlers from Britain and around the world. He gave countless young wrestlers, including me, their first real opportunity. And for over 50 years, he never stopped working. So when people say when Brian Dixon died, British wrestling died, I understand exactly what they mean. Not because wrestling ended, it didn't. Not because All-Star Wrestling ended. It didn't. But because one of the last remaining links to the Golden Age, the man who carried British wrestling on his shoulders through its darkest years, was no longer there. Brian Dixon wasn't just a promoter of All-Star Wrestling. He was its heart. And I don't think British wrestling will ever see another promoter quite like him. So now it's over to you. What are your favourite memories of Brian Dixon and All-Star Wrestling? Whether you saw him at Butlins, your local town hall, or were lucky enough to work for him, I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. And if you want more wrestling stories, opinions, and laughs, you know what to do. And remember, I'll see you on the next one.